Hey everyone, welcome back to Engelbard Gaming. Today I've got another hardware review for you. I'll be looking at the Ayn Thor. This dual-screen Android device has been doing the rounds here on old YouTube since before it started shipping to customers around October of 2025. So what more could possibly be said about it? Good question, and keep watching to find out the answer. But in short, I've spent several weeks putting this system through its paces and have a lot to say about it. And now for the normal disclosures. I paid for this device with my own money and I am not working with Ayn in any capacity. They have no input into the contents of this review and they will not see it before, or probably even after, it goes live. As usual, all opinions are my own. I'll also note that this is probably going to be my last hardware review for a good long while, and possibly ever. I'll talk more about that at the very end of the video. One quick technical note about this video. I have some camera footage here of the Thor in action, and the rest of the footage is direct capture from the Thor itself. I used a USB-C cable connected to an HDMI capture device. All of the game footage you see in this video is actually running on the Thor itself, even when you see full screen capture footage. Alright, time to dive into this review and see if the Ayn Thor just might be the best general purpose gaming handheld device ever made. At first glance, the Ayn Thor looks a lot like a thicker 3DS XL or LL for those more familiar with Japanese systems. But open the clamshell up and folks, it's clear from the get-go that this is a premium newer device. It's quite a sight to behold. Frankly, it's gorgeous, it's heavy, and feels like the kind of handheld Nintendo should be putting out these days. Let's begin with the controls. The Thor has two medium-sized analog sticks with click functionality, an excellent D-pad, the usual 4 face buttons in diamond formation, 4 shoulder buttons, start and select buttons, and a couple of Android navigation buttons for back and home. Aside from those, we also have an AYN button on the bottom center of the unit that calls up a special control panel that lets you do several things, including seeing some performance readouts for the system and letting you manage which screen is the primary one at the moment, and whether you want to show both screens or turn one off, among several other options. All the controls feel great, except for maybe the lower shoulder buttons or trigger buttons. They're okay, but they just aren't great. The minor issue is that the angle of activation for the triggers is a smidge awkward, at least for my medium-sized hands, which is probably why I've seen a few reports of these buttons actually breaking. Take heart though, it is not a widespread issue, and through nearly a month of testing mine, my triggers are still perfectly fine and in working order and feel like the day they were new. Now also on the front of the unit, near the bottom of it, we will see a pair of front-firing stereo speakers, and I'm going to talk about their performance a little bit later. But let's move on to those screens. Oh, those screens. I cannot sing their praises enough. The top screen is a 1080p 6-inch AMOLED screen with 120Hz refresh rate. It is absolutely gorgeous, one of the best screens I've ever seen, and if you think I won't gush on and on about it throughout the rest of this review, well, you're wrong! The lower screen is 1240 by 1080 and has a 60Hz refresh rate, and it's the same screen that we've seen on the Retroid Pocket Classic, which I reviewed here a while back, and several other devices. It is also fantastic. Now along the bottom of the unit, we have a USB-C port for charging and also video out, a micro SD card slot, a headphone jack, and also power and volume buttons. And with that, here comes my second very mild criticism of the unit, which is that I wish the USB-C port had been on the back of the Thor instead of the front, since it's a bit awkward to use if you have the device plugged in. Another minor criticism that some may have here is that the Thor screens are not in proportion with any model of the DS or 3DS. But in my experience using the device when playing DS and 3DS games, it did not bother me in the slightest. Other Thor owners have complained about the angles on which the top screen locks into place. It locks into 2 separate angles, both of which are different from any model of the DS or 3DS. Again, for me, I found this to be a complete non-issue. Now, I'd be remiss if I didn't also mention that some people have complained of broken or cracked hinges. Like the issue I've seen with triggers mentioned here and there, this does not seem to be a widespread issue about 4 months into the Thor's commercial life. Having said that, I do wish the hinge felt a smidge more solid while the system is opened. Now overall, the Thor is a slick, premium portable game system that some will likely think is their endgame handheld. If you don't know what the term endgame means in this context, it's that the system is so good you'll never need a different one. From a design standpoint, I think with just a few minor improvements, this thing would have been practically perfect. Now, some may find the rectangular design a little uncomfortable to hold for long periods, especially older people like me who might even have a touch of arthritis, but grips alleviate that problem to a large extent, and you can buy some cheap ones direct from AYN or even 3D print your own. Here's the one that AYN sells for just under $15 that I usually attach while playing. And speaking of that, let me talk about what I added to the Thor myself. I bought it with the grip that AYN offers along with their case. Do you need to buy a case? Probably not. But I live in a house with many pets, so for me it was an absolute must to make sure I kept the Thor safe. This grip that AYN sells, it's alright, but it's not perfect, and I'm thinking about just 3D printing some to try them out and see how they are, and I'll talk about those at a later time. Now, I did also get myself a 1 terabyte memory card and filled it to the brim. Alright, I'm going to shake a few things up for this review and do some of the things out of my usual order. For example, let me start by telling you who the AYN Thor is for before I go into its performance. Lately, in most hardware reviews, I've told you that the devices are great for a specialized audience looking for maybe one thing, and that's what differentiates one device from another. Now, the Thor does fall into that a bit, since it is a specialized device of its own that is designed to appeal to people who want to play DS and 3DS games as comfortably as possible with perhaps some rendering improvements. But even though that is its main focus, it's really so much more than that, and it's a device that should appeal to just about everybody. For example, the Thor is powerful enough to play several modern PC games, which you can do through apps like WinLater, GameHub Lite, or Game Native. Aside from that, you can emulate just about any classic console up through the PS2 and GameCube, and even a lot of Switch games will run fine, and you might get okay performance out of a few PS3 and Xbox games, but we'll talk about those shortly. Now, obviously, if you want to play 3DS and DS games, the Thor is practically ideal. The only other Android device really competing with it right now is the Ayan Pocket DS, which is significantly more expensive than the Thor. And if you haven't been following the news, Ayan doesn't exactly have the best reputation at the moment. Getting back to the Thor, it also runs a specialized version of Cemu, the Wii U emulator, pretty well that can show the gamepad screen on the bottom screen. And there's even a specialized version of Vita 3K that cleverly uses the bottom screen as the back touchpad of the PlayStation Vita. There are so many great uses of the dual screen setup, and with the extreme popularity of the Thor, I imagine we'll see a lot more creative uses for its dual screen setup in the future. So I reviewed the AYN Odin 2 on the channel some time ago, and it was a pretty great device. I used it a lot, but not quite as much as I planned to for a few reasons. Why am I even bringing up the Odin 2? Because most versions of the Thor use the same SoC or system on a chip as the Odin 2 and its variants, the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2. So as you'd rightly expect, performance is generally similar between the devices. But if you haven't kept up with software performance on that setup in a while, it's worth taking a fresh look at. I'll also add there's another version of the system called the Thor Lite that uses the older and less powerful, but still pretty good, Snapdragon 865. I am not covering that one today, as it would need its own review since the internal hardware is different. This version of the Thor that I'm reviewing here today is the base version, which includes 8GB of RAM and 128GB of storage space, and only comes in the color black. There is also the Pro version of the Thor that comes with 12GB of RAM and 256GB of storage space, and then the Max version of the Thor, which comes with 16GB of RAM and a massive 1TB of internal storage. Now, the base, Pro, and Max versions of the Thor all use the same Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 chip. The only internal difference between the devices are the amounts of RAM and storage included. So while the base is only available in black, as I said, the other bonuses that the Pro and Max get is that they're offered in 4 different colors currently: white, black, rainbow, and clear purple. Game performance on the Thor is fantastic, better than I even hoped it would be. The problem I noticed with the Odin 2, which again uses the same SoC, was that several emulators suffered from pretty significant input delay, more so than other cheaper devices in some cases. However, the input delay on the Thor, especially when running a top screen at 120Hz, is negligible. I was able to play some rhythm games that felt nearly as good as they do on actual hardware, which is a huge improvement over the Odin 2. I should add that running the system at 60Hz will absolutely result in more noticeable input latency. There's only one circumstance in which I recommend running the Thor at 60Hz instead of 120, and I'll talk about that shortly. But first, let me talk a smidge about those beautiful screens again. The color depth is amazing, and the blacks are so deep that when you play this with the lights out, it just looks like those saturated screens are floating in front of you and not attached to anything at all, which helps tremendously with systems that use weird aspect ratios. You just don't see the sides of the screens while they're black, and personally, I don't even see the bezels or edges of the device in that situation either. I had high expectations for these screens, and they have absolutely been met. So back to the games here. Games for dual-screen systems like the DS, 3DS, and Wii U run very well on the Thor. For DS and 3DS, you can apply all sorts of visual enhancements, like upping the internal 3D rendering resolution and applying 2D filters, usually without losing a shred of full-speed performance. And as you'll notice, I did use the word usually there, because you may hit a game here or there that needs a little bit more horsepower to run, and you might have to lower those effects a little bit. But I never had to go lower than 2 times resolution for any DS or 3DS game. I can't imagine any DS or 3DS fan being disappointed with performance, and you have several emulator options for each system. For standard DS, there are versions of Melon DS and Drastic that fully support the Thor's dual-screen setup. For 3DS, well, that situation is a bit fluid, but Azahar and Citra MMJ both do excellent jobs. I've personally found myself primarily using Citra MMJ for a few reasons, since it has less stuttering during shader compilation and the like, but the Azahar team just recently announced that they've improved that shader compilation situation in that emulator as well. So let's talk a little bit about Nintendo DS emulation first. I generally prefer to play DS games with a larger top screen like this. You can also reverse which screen is on top and which screen is on bottom, which is handy for a whole bunch of games. But in Melon DS at least, you can save different screen setups, allowing you to change the proportion of the top screen to exactly match the bottom. I do this for certain DS games like Contra 4 and Sonic Rush, and the mainline Dragon Quest 4, 5, and 6 remakes that really depend on both screens being the same size and lined up. I mentioned just a moment or two ago that I talk about when 60Hz operation for both screens is preferable to 120 on the top screen, and well, these games are that exception. If you need the top and bottom screens to stay in sync during DS emulation, then you want to run both screens at 60Hz. If you leave the top screen on 120Hz, you'll notice obvious tearing on the bottom screen, but the top screen will be fine. For all other systems, I suggest 120Hz mode all the time. So let's move on to 3DS. Now right away, I'm going to admit that I'm one of the few people that seem to actually really love the 3D effect on the actual real 3DS. I know it's popular to hate on that effect these days and say that it sucked or that it caused you headaches or whatever, but there were a lot of games where the sense of depth was awesome, and I do very much miss that here. While 3DS games look absolutely great at higher resolutions on the Thor, while playing stuff like the Zelda games, Super Mario 3D Land, or Etrian Odyssey 4, everything just looked kind of weirdly flat to me without that 3D effect that I was used to. But having said that, 3DS games do run really great on the Thor, as I mentioned, and you'll be able to play a lot of them without any issues. Bumping up that internal resolution can really be transformative for some games, and even better, if you search the old interwebs, you'll find that many games have either patches or cheats that let you run them at 60 frames per second instead of 30. Even without the 3D, the 3DS experience offered by the Thor is really top-notch. But if you want that 3D effect, right now, it's hard to recommend anything other than the original 3DS or new 3DS hardware. Rounding out the dual-screen section of my review here is the Wii U. There's a version of Cemu, the only current and practical Wii U emulator out there, that supports dual-screen Android devices like the Thor. And a quick side note, if you get that yourself, you can only open the in-game menu in Cemu on the Thor by swiping from the left side of the screen to the right. The back button will not open that menu. With this version of Cemu, you'll get the main TV screen on your top screen and the Wii U gamepad down on the bottom, at least by default. Now the Wii U gamepad had a 16:9 aspect ratio, so cramming that screen into the Thor's 31:27 aspect ratio bottom screen makes it letterboxed and kinda tiny. But that is rarely an issue in practice. The screen is just really small, and a lot of the Wii U games that make use of the gamepad screen often put giant buttons on it, so it's still very accessible. If you've been waiting to dive into Wii U emulation because you didn't like that the gamepad wasn't fully accessible on, say, devices like computers, well, devices like Thor make the prospect much more appealing, and you can have a really good time with it on the Thor. Now let's talk about some other higher-end systems that sometimes have trouble on devices like this. Regarding the PlayStation 2, you can use NetherSX or a few other PlayStation 2 emulators to play a lot of that system's library at higher resolutions than the real thing while maintaining full speed. You might have to check out a few different versions of PS2 emulators to play some specific games, but I'm just using the standard newest NetherSX release, and just about everything I've thrown at it works great. Your mileage could definitely vary, so check out compatibility lists and videos of your favorite game running before pulling the trigger on buying a Thor for that purpose. Next, let's talk about Dolphin, which emulates GameCube and Wii. Dolphin runs great, again at boosted internal resolutions with various effects for both systems. Dolphin is a great experience on the Thor overall, and even difficult to run games like Rogue Leader work really great on it. There's plenty of really good GameCube and Wii games out there if you want to take your collection on the go. Everything I tested runs fantastically on the system. Again, I don't want to categorically say that every single game made for both systems will work fantastically, because with both systems, there's still a few problem games out there. But out of the 50 or so GameCube and Wii games I tested on the Thor, I did not have a problem in performance with a single one of them. Next, how about a quick peek at some Vita games using Vita 3K? I'm only going to show two of them here. Vita 3K can run some games perfectly, a bunch of games okay, some with fairly major problems, and a bunch not at all. So absolutely do not buy a Thor for Vita emulation. Consider any Vita games that work well a bonus at this point. Dragon Quest Builders runs pretty well on Vita 3K, but there are occasional minor glitches with the backgrounds. Dragon's Crown ran great for the early game, but I still can't say it's problem-free all the way throughout, because I haven't played it all the way through. If you check the Vita 3K website, you'll see they have an updated compatibility list there, as well as a built-in compatibility rating system for games right within the emulator. Now, Vita 3K still isn't fully mature yet, but you might get lucky and have a favorite game or two that work well in it. Now, PSP emulation, as we go down the ladder a bit, is a breeze on the Thor with PPSSPP. As with other prior systems mentioned, you can run games at multiple times their original resolution, usually without them skipping a beat. PSP emulation is usually pretty awesome even on weaker devices, so shouldn't surprise anyone that it runs great on the Thor. But it's always nice to see things that run well even when you enhance them like crazy, and that's exactly what you get here. Now let's drop down a rung here to the Saturn. You can run most Saturn games without any issues at all in Beetle Saturn in RetroArch. Again, not much of a surprise considering the hardware, but still good to see. Also, this is another case where running the Thor at 120Hz leads to much less noticeable input lag. While other systems using the same chipset like the aforementioned Odin 2 could technically run the Saturn just fine, I found that the input delay really hampered the experience on that system for me. I'm happy to report that that is not a problem here on the Thor. And let's go over to Dreamcast, which may technically be a more powerful system, but is easier to emulate than the Saturn. As you can see here, Dreamcast emulation is perfectly fine. I'm using Redream for this footage here, but you can also run a number of other Dreamcast emulators on Android without any noticeable issues. So I would say out of the 20 or so Dreamcast games I tested, I did not have a problem with any one of them. And then let's drop down one more rung here to the original PlayStation, which is usually easy to run on just about anything these days, and I'm happy to report that it also runs just fine on the Thor. Again, not exactly a surprise. And from here on out, I'm going to show you a quicker montage of games running on older generation systems, so you can see that all is well on that front, and then I'll be back with you in about 30 seconds. Alright, let's jump ahead into the future. What newer systems can the Thor handle? Well, at this point we've got emulators for systems like the Switch, the PlayStation 3, the Xbox, and the Xbox 360. But how good are they? Let's start with the Switch. Various forks of Yuzu are still out there, and Nintendo have been making news recently for shutting down more of the newer ones like Eden that have popped up. However, once something is on the internet, you know how it is, it's basically impossible to ever get rid of it. So you can still find Eden out there. How is it? As always, it varies by the game, not just for Eden, but for any of the Switch emulators that you look at, like Yuzu, Citron, Ryubing, or whatever. Some run games better than others, some games will run near flawlessly on one emulator or on all of them, some won't work at all on any of them. It's like the old box of chocolates thing. My advice is don't get a Thor just for Switch emulation. You will likely be able to run a bunch of your favorite Switch games, but almost definitely not all of them. So no disrespect intended to any of the emulator authors out there, it's still a newer system and there are a lot of kinks to still be worked out. Now for PlayStation 3, it's still very early days on Android. I ran a few games, namely Afterburner Climax and Daytona USA a couple of weeks ago. It took a lot of tweaking and messing around with things to get them going, but I managed to get them going. However, when I went to record the footage for this video, guess what? They had stopped working entirely. They just won't run anymore. They crash all the time now. You can tinker with PS3 emulation at the moment, but don't expect the Thor to be a viable solution for PlayStation 3 games on the go. At least, not yet. It's still super early. But I will say that Afterburner Climax and Daytona USA both ran surprisingly smoothly when they did work, even though both had graphical glitches. On the Xbox and Xbox 360 front, it's just not worth it yet. Like PS3 emulators on Android, these are still very early. You might get lucky and find a game or two that work okay, but it'll probably take some time for these emulators to mature. You might have some fun tinkering around with them though, so I don't want to discourage you from trying them. Just don't have the notion that going into purchasing a Thor that you'll be able to play Xbox or Xbox 360 games in a normal manner. Moving on to PC games, how well can the Thor run those games? And depending on the game, the answer is often surprisingly well. We've got Android apps today from GameHub, GameHub Lite, Game Native, and WinLater, and maybe some more I don't even know about. The footage you're seeing here is all running in GameHub Lite. Now before I get into this, the Thor is absolutely not a replacement for something like the Steam Deck. It won't run as many games and won't run many of the ones that it does run as well as a dedicated system like the Steam Deck. But it can run a pretty good amount of PC games without issues. 2D games, which are usually lighter on the requirements, often run great, and being able to snag them from your existing Steam library is equally great. Some of the software out there also supports the Epic Games Store and GOG. Other sort of mid-tier 3D games might run anywhere from extremely well to barely at all. Or if you're unlucky, not at all. Not every game works. Higher end games, you'll almost definitely need to drop settings to get anywhere near playable frame rates from them. Still, PC games are another awesome bonus for the Thor, but if they're the main thing you want to play, I'd suggest a dedicated device that handles those. Still, you can play a good amount of PC games on the Thor, and many of them will probably run considerably better than you might expect. As I mentioned earlier, all of the game footage here is recorded from my actual Thor unit, even the full screen stuff. It has HDMI and DisplayPort out over USB-C, so you can get the appropriate cable, hook it up to your TV or monitor, and away you go. One note though, you'll have to go into the Thor settings option in the settings menu and enable HDMI out at the appropriate resolution and refresh rate. By default, things are set to run at 1080p and 30 Hz, which is terrible. It also wouldn't take any of my changes until I changed the setting and then rebooted the Thor. After that, all was well. And I have to say, while there are some input delay issues that have often been associated with HDMI out, it was way less than I expected and less than the last time I used HDMI out on other handheld game systems. So with all this power and great performance, what kind of battery life does the Thor get? And the answer, again, is pretty great. And I know it depends on what you're running, but if you're playing mostly classic systems, you'll get somewhere between 15 and 20 hours between charges. If you're doing something more advanced like Wii U, Switch, or PC games, you might only get somewhere like 2 to 5 hours, and the bottom of the Thor may also get uncomfortably warm. There are some detailed charts that users have put together on battery life drain per individual emulator at various different settings. Now, I'm not going to go that far into the weeds for this review, but you can Google those if you want to see specifics. One thing I'll note is that turning the bottom screen off while playing on the top screen didn't really seem to have much of an impact on overall battery life. And also, I'll say when you see that 20% warning come around, be prepared because battery drain happens much more quickly in the bottom fifth of a charge than during the rest of the charge in my experience. Before I start this segment about what AYN should have done differently with the Thor, I want to state that frankly, they did a hell of a job with the Thor in general. Just because I'm about to talk about what I think they should have done differently, that doesn't mean that the system is bad. It's not. It's absolutely fantastic, but it's just not perfect. And I can summarize this section just with the minor criticisms I mentioned earlier, some that were mine and some that were out there on the internet. For me, I feel like the speakers should have been better. The equalizer built into newer updates of the operating system have improved that situation quite a bit, but they aren't even close to the quality of the speakers on something like the Steam Deck. The angle of the triggers should have definitely been adjusted a smidge. Maybe they should have also been a little bit lower, which would make the back of the unit less flat, but would have improved the gameplay experience tremendously. I also wish the bottom screen was 4x3 or something closer to that, which could have made the entire system slightly wider, but that also would have allowed AYN to put the speakers on either side of the top screen. They definitely should have moved the charging port to the back. I don't think anyone can argue on that one. And strengthening the hinge would have also been a nice improvement. It feels a tad less stable than I would like when the device is opened. If AYN had done even just a few of these things, I'd probably declare the Thor a 10 out of 10 device. As it is, it's still really close to that, not to spoil the final review. So what else can you do with the Thor? Well, the Thor is really versatile, or versatile, however you prefer to pronounce that. How versatile is it? Well, apps running on the top screen and bottom screens can have independent audio volumes. You can also switch which screen apps are running on. Want to watch a video and play a game like I'm doing right here? Well, you can set that up however you like it. Want to run a game with game facts on the bottom screen? You can do that. Someone's even made an app that will save your place in the FAQ. Having two screens accessible at any time is beyond great, and if you don't need two screens active at the same time, you can turn one off to save a little bit of battery life, but as I mentioned earlier, beware, it won't save you much, just a little. And you can also do a lot of customization on the Thor. A lot of people like using game-centric launchers like Cocoon, but what can I say, crusty old me prefers just using the standard launcher and manually loading my games and the apps that I'm running them from. If you want info on those alternative launchers, you can check out some links in the description. So what is my ultimate opinion on the AYN Thor now that I've had it for about a month and have used it extensively? The Thor is good, really good. I am extremely happy with it. I'd love to make this my first ever 10 out of 10 review, but I'm gonna reel myself in a little bit because there are a few notable flaws with the device. So I'm gonna give the Thor a 9 out of 10. And remember, I don't do 0.5 increments or anything, so I'll just say imagine that this is a very high 9, and the Thor towers over all the other portable devices that I've reviewed up to this point. I cannot envision any gamer who is into emulation and specifically playing DS and 3DS games not loving the Thor. It does so much so right. Sure, there are some minor quibbles, but they are legitimate, and you'll see some people mentioning things other than what I've covered in my own personal experience. So no, the Thor isn't perfect, but right now, for emulation and gaming versatility, it's easily the king of the hill. Before I close this review out, I have to talk about the fluid price situation here. When I bought my Thor as part of the second preview batch offered by AYN, I got it on December 23rd when it was selling for $299 for the base unit. During the batch 3 pre-order process for Thors, because of the insane RAM situation going on right now, AYN raised the prices of the base unit by $10 to $309, and they increased the Pro and Max prices by more than that. AYN just announced a few days ago that prices were again increasing because of the RAM situation, and now the base unit covered here is $319, while the Pro and Max have gone up by significantly more than that. Now, the RAM shortage plaguing the entire tech industry right now is expected to continue into 2027, so while I don't want to instill FOMO into anyone, the reality here has proven that the longer you wait, the more likely you're going to have to pay more if you want to buy a Thor, at least in the near future. So I suggest, if you're interested, don't wait, order one now. I have zero affiliation in any way with AYN, I'm just someone who has been observing what's going on in the industry. When AYN announced the most recent price increase, it wasn't supposed to go into effect until April, but AYN moved that up to, well, today unfortunately, because their vendor prices have already gone up. Now, the one weird thing in all of this is that the price of the Thor Lite so far has not increased and remains $250 even after the latest increase for all the other Thors. Now, at first, when there was just a $50 difference between the Lite and the base, I would have said go for the base, it's a no-brainer. At the current $70 difference, I'd say the decision is a lot less clear-cut. And if there are future price increases, it's going to be even less clear-cut. So what I think about all this is, if what you primarily care about are DS and 3DS and systems below those, then getting a Lite may be the best option now or if the prices increase again. You'll definitely give up some performance on the higher end of the spectrum, no question about it. But if you weren't going to play those systems anyway, you haven't lost anything, right? I really wish I had a Lite to review for you, but that's not in the cards right now. I'll talk about that in just a moment. When all is said and done here, I love the AYN Thor, and it is bar none my favorite indie handheld. Nothing else is even close, and I haven't touched any of my other handheld devices since getting the Thor. The AYN Thor might not be for everyone, but I'm struggling to think of any gamer that could try this system and not walk away a huge fan of it. The pricing situation sucks right now, but as I've said, that's an industry problem, and other companies like Retroid have also started to raise the prices of their existing devices. Now, at what price point will the Thor base model be overpriced and just not worth it? I think most people won't be too upset if they get it for about $340-ish. I mean, no one wants to pay more. I wish it was even less than $300, but you'll probably still be happy with your purchase if you get a base unit at that price or lower. Now, if you want the Pro or the Max, well, that's something you're going to have to decide for yourself, and you're going to have to consider those prices and what they represent. So the Pro has just gone up to $399 and the Max to $489. And just FYI, if the extra storage for games is your main concern, a 1TB SD card from a decent brand goes for roughly $80 to $90 right now. I got mine for $80 and it's a Silicon Power, which I've had many of before and I trust will at least last a good long while. Now, if you want that storage space and you want to get a base unit and then spend $80 for that size SD card, that'll put you at $399, which is the same price as the Pro, but you'll have 4 gigs less RAM while also having 4 times the storage space. So those are the factors that you'll have to weigh when making your decision. So now it's your turn. What do you think? Do you have an AYN Thor? Have you already ordered one and you're just waiting for the next batch to ship? Do you prefer Ioneo's larger and pricier Pocket DS? Are the price increases killing this for you? Tell me all about it in the comments. And now a quick note before closing. For almost all the hardware reviews on this channel, I have to buy the devices myself. There have only been a few exceptions to that. I have a lot of financial obligations and I can't afford to just keep buying $300+ systems whenever they come out. I've reached out to the companies like AYN and Retroid and Ambernick, but I'm still too much of a little guy to get any attention from them at this point. Now, I like doing these reviews and I would love to keep them going, but unless I get some more money coming in from the channel, I just will not be able to do much more of them, if any. The funds that I used to buy stuff like this had been coming from a combination of Patreon and YouTube ad revenue over the past couple of years. But both of those things have slowed down a lot this past year. And it's not me being greedy, I'm not out there throwing parties on a yacht somewhere. I'm just an older guy that loves gaming and tech, who has a family to support, a full-time job, loads of bills, graduate school to pay for, and more. So if you want to see hardware reviews on devices like this in the future, please consider contributing to Patreon or dropping a super thanks here on YouTube. And for a very specific example, if you want to see a review of the Thor Lite and how it compares to the base unit, if I can get enough contributions to cover the cost of buying a Thor Lite, I'll order one of those immediately because I'd love to see the differences and tell you about them myself. But that's enough about that. So that'll do it for this video, my retro gaming friends. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a like and share it online somewhere. If you like what I do here and want to support me, as I mentioned, you can do that on Patreon, Ko-fi, or right here on YouTube through super thanks and channel memberships. If you haven't yet, please subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you won't miss any of my videos. With that, I'll say thank you for watching and see me later.